Hello and welcome to the Virtual Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester and I'm the Director of the Hammer's Public Programs, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to our sixth and final talk in the series, Rembrandt Here and Now. In this series of 6 talks on the artist Rembrandt van Rijn by art historian John Walsh, we've learned much about Rembrandt's drawings, paintings, and etchings. It's really a testament to the enduring legacy of Rembrandt over the past 400 years and how his work has transcended time and culture that this series has been so popular, with over 5,000 viewers tuning in so far from 23 countries. It's also a testament to the deep scholarship and enthralling approach to art history of our guide, John Walsh. I don't know of any other scholar who's so skilled at bringing all of us non-experts in the audience into the art historical discourse. He's so deft at weaving the threads of Rembrandt's subjects, iconography, style, period, and historical context all together into a fascinating narrative and helping us all see connections that we wouldn't necessarily see on our own. He's definitely opened my eyes, and so many of you have written us to say the same. So I'm very grateful to John for agreeing to give this wonderful series of talks. Walsh was the director of the J. Paul Getty Museum from 1983 until 2000, and prior to that he was a curator of painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Walsh taught art history at Columbia and Harvard Universities and currently teaches part-time at Yale. He's the author of many articles and catalogs on Dutch painting of the 17th century and of several books, including the J. Paul Getty Museum and its Collections, a museum for the new century. He currently serves on the boards of the Hammer Museum and of the Yale University Art Gallery. And if you want to view even more art history talks by Walsh, he gave a wonderful 3-lecture series at the Hammer on Vincent van Gogh last fall, and the videos are currently available on the Hammer website. And there are also many lecture series by Walsh recorded at Yale University and available on Yale's YouTube channels. At the end of today's presentation, John will be happy to take audience questions, which you can submit via the chat window on your screen, so please stay around for that. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Walsh.
Thanks, Claudia. I'm going to seize the moment to thank you some more for inviting me here to give these talks in the first place and coaching me through all this Zooming stuff, which required some skill and patience on your part. And let me add how much I admire the programs you put on at the Hammer Museum. Day after day, week after week, all year long, plague season or not. I mean, I don't know another museum anywhere that devotes so much energy and inspiration and belief to recruiting all kinds of people to get on stage and explore art and the arts and public issues free of charge for the benefit of us citizens. A lot of that energy and belief is yours, Claudia. I mean, it's encouraged by your director, Anne Philbin, the deputy director, Cynthia Burlingham, supported by the tech magician Brian Springer, with a lot of help from the versatile Janani Sobranian. So I'm so grateful to all of you. In the previous talk, we looked at some of Rembrandt's late paintings of historical and religious subjects, and some large works commissioned by prestigious organizations in Amsterdam, including guilds and the city itself, pictures painted to hang in prominent places. Despite that, a myth has persisted that in his last years, Rembrandt, the artist, went down in the world. Now that's true financially. He was a poor manager. He'd gone bankrupt in 1656, but he was still the most important artist in Northern Europe. His portraits and history paintings were still in demand among people who understood what he was doing. Today, we're going to look closely at this picture, the so-called Jewish bride in the Rijksmuseum, and we're going to use it as a key to Rembrandt's interests in the last decade of his life, as well as to his painting technique. First, as usual, let's just look. I'm going to show some details, and after a few minutes, I'll start talking again. a man and a woman. He in middle age, she younger, dressed in rich costumes that are not contemporary, but belong to a generalized historical category that the Dutch called antiques. It's a hybrid of medieval and Renaissance costume, like ones we've seen Rembrandt give to characters in his historical scenes and actually wear himself for self-portraits. He has a jerkin down to his knees with slashed sleeves of elaborately worked golden cloth. She wears a red skirt and a bodice of translucent batiste and a string of large pearls. He's embracing her in a protective or maybe possessive way. With one hand, he holds her shoulder, and with the other, he touches her breast. She puts one hand on his, and in the other hand, she holds something that was thought for a long time to be a flower, but now has been identified as a small orange, a fruit that symbolized fertility. They incline towards each other. They look toward one another, but their eyes don't meet. Light plays across them softly and makes a sea of highlights on their clothes. The background is indistinct, but over to the right, we can make out a shrub in a pot and a wall, and in the center, what looks like a niche behind the figures. It's a scene of great tenderness, if not sensuality. But who are these people and what are they doing? The first recorded title of the picture dates to 1828, when it was called Jephthah and His Daughter. In other words, an Old Testament subject, but not likely to be the right one, despite recent attempts to reinstate it. A later owner of the picture thought it was a marriage scene, with the father putting a necklace on his daughter, the bride. The bride idea may have been suggested by two of Rembrandt's etchings, which were thought, both of them, at the time to represent Jewish brides, but neither etching actually did any such thing. In the 18th and 19th century, many of Rembrandt's pictures were thought to represent Jews. It was assumed that he had an especially sympathetic relation with Jewish people, and that he chose to live in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, which in fact was not all Jewish, but had a mixed population and was a prosperous neighborhood, even chic. This affinity that Rembrandt is supposed to have had with Jews is now, we think, very much exaggerated, one of the many myths of Rembrandt's unconventional behavior. But the picture had one biblical interpretation that's held up ever since it was proposed in 1925. It's believed to show the scene in Genesis after God had sent Isaac and his beautiful wife Rebekah to live among the Philistines, who were the sometime enemies of the Israelites. The Philistines didn't know that the two were married, and Isaac was afraid that if the Philistines learned that they were married, they'd murder him to get their hands on his lovely wife. So he pretended to be her brother. They kept their true relationship secret. Later on, the king, Abimelech, looked out his window and saw them sporting. That's the euphemism preferred by the King James Version. Sporting, it says, as only married people do. The king chastised Isaac for lying about the relationship, but he warned his people to stay away from Isaac and Rebekah on pain of death. What identified the painting was as Isaac and Rebekah was this drawing by Rembrandt, which is a quick compositional sketch that shows what we see in the Jewish bride. The poses are the same. Both of them are smiling. The setting is somewhat clearer, and the drawing where the arrow now is pointing shows something important that we're missing from the painting. There at the upper right is the king in the window, spying on them. Recently, Ernst von der Wetering has reported that technical evidence from the widths of the canvas and the absence of stretch marks at the top suggests something that you won't be surprised to hear that it's been cut down and that the drawing indicates something like its original extent. In the bottom illustration, you see the drawing copied in black and white, and the existing painting outlined in red. It's a lot smaller. Not everybody was persuaded. The Rijksmuseum curators look at the same evidence and disagree. But in any case, the main changes between the drawing and the painting were made by Rembrandt himself. He moved the potted plant closer to the figures, and he eliminated the king. Now, he didn't need to start from scratch for his composition. He just needed to consult prints, as we've often seen him doing. Here are two prints he probably knew. At the left, a Roman printmaker copying a composition by Raphael in the Vatican Palace, where Isaac holds her in much the same way, but she is much more demonstrative. And at the top, Abimelech looks on. And at the right, another version by a Dutch engraver, where Isaac's hands do pretty much what they do in Rembrandt's version. Compared to the prints, the sexuality in Rembrandt's composition is decorous. It's implied rather than spelled out. But at the beginning, Rembrandt had a different idea for her pose. An X-ray reveals folds in Rebecca's skirt that show that originally she slung her leg over Isaac's, just as she does in Raphael's composition. Rembrandt thought better of that, so he painted Isaac's costume over it, and that's what we see now. There may have been a particular reason why he did that, and also why he chose not to include the voyeur king in the window. The reason would be that this was a portrait of an actual contemporary married couple who wished to or agreed to be represented in the guise of Old Testament couple, a couple that was held up in 17th century writers' work as an example of virtue and mutual devotion. If that's so, and I think it is, their portrait didn't need a peeping Tom. What mattered was their devotion, not the details of any particular incident. And her slung leg may have gone beyond the bounds of decorum in the minds of the people it was painted for. But what about the basic proposition here that a Dutch man and wife commissioned a picture of themselves as an exemplary couple in Genesis? Is that really plausible? Yes, it is. Here are a couple of roughly contemporary portraits of people as Old Testament characters. At the right is a woman we've met in an earlier talk, the Queen of Bohemia, who was living in exile at the court in The Hague. She had hopes of being restored to her throne and had Honthorst paint her as Esther, the Jewish heroine who'd managed to protect her captive people while they were in bondage in Babylon. This wasn't just flattery, it was also propaganda for her restoration. The other picture shows a wealthy Amsterdam merchant and his wife in Old Testament outfits as Isaac and Rebecca, our couple. Now, this was possibly piety on their part, I imagine. And it turned out to be a windfall for the painter here, Ferdinand Bol, who was Rembrandt's former pupil, because after her rich husband died, Bol married the widow here, the woman in the picture, and he was set for life. I want to drop a footnote into this discussion. There's a small painting of a man in the Metropolitan Museum that during my time there and ever since has been thought to be Rembrandtesque and good, but probably not by Rembrandt himself. Van der Wetering has proposed that it's not only very good, but it actually served as an oil sketch for the head of Isaac. I now think the Met has regained a Rembrandt, and I think you can see why. The likeness is close. The painting technique looks like Rembrandt's, as Van der Wetering has defined it. It's got the mix of thick and thin passages, impulsive marks, scratches in the paint for details, and other traits that are part of Rembrandt's distinctive repertory, not some pupil or imitator. But I want us to look at the surfaces. You saw at the beginning how these fabrics catch the light, how his sleeve glitters and her skirt glows. Seductive effects that Rembrandt produced by means that you can make out by looking up close. The paint is thick and scraped. It looks troweled on or daubed, as the biographer Houbraken complained. Rembrandt used a palette knife to make those high ridges, which not only imitate folds in the cloth, but actually catch the light, our light, and makes real highlights, not painted ones. He also scratched some areas, like the one on the far left, to make them look like a layer of thin, translucent cloth, particularly over the cape Isaac wears. Rebecca's skirt has some of those scraped ridges that sparkle. And also at the far right in the picture, there are long diagonal strokes of the palette knife. Other highlights are just dabbed on, like the sleeve at the top right. And her fingers are roughly painted with many detached brush strokes. What also strikes me in front of this picture is the suggestive power of the colors. I get a subliminal sense of human warmth that's produced by yellow, the color of splendor, and by red, the color of blood. I think those associations register with us, even if we don't identify them immediately. And I think they reinforce the poses and gesture. And there's the glitter of light over the surface, which changes with the angle of your view. I don't think any painter before Rembrandt ever paid such attention to the texture of the paint, including Titian and Rubens. Many of his surfaces are worked to produce a three-dimensional liveliness that you find only in relief sculpture. And nobody had ever created the illusion of so many different textures in the same picture, from smooth to rough. So Rembrandt suppressed the kinky, kind of voyeuristic part of the story. He concentrated on the essential part, the situation of Isaac and Rebecca, lovers devoted to one another by duty and by feeling. And he helps us experience that devotion by the richness of these colors and textures. There's another married couple in the mid-1660s in the Metropolitan Museum. The two wear costumes that would also have been called antiques, like those of Isaac and Rebecca. But their format is conventional for pair portraits, and even old-fashioned, separate, but composed to complement each other, turning toward one another. Rembrandt's woman makes a gesture like Memling's woman almost a century earlier. She has a carnation, a symbol since the Middle Age of marriage or engagement. She holds it out towards the place that her husband's portrait would occupy. The man holds a magnifying glass. The magnifying glass, for years, sent scholars off in different directions for an explanation. Most recently, Walter Liedtke connected it to the profession of a man whose portrait Rembrandt etched, a man called Peter Haring, a lawyer who worked as an auctioneer and was presumably something of an art expert, a man with a sharp eye that would be symbolized by the magnifying glass. Rembrandt drew Haring on the etching plate in just the way he saw him, but since the plate prints everything in reverse on the paper, we need to turn the etching around in mirror image if we want to see Haring the way Rembrandt did. When we do that and we isolate the head, he looks more familiar. He has the long face, long nose, high forehead, hair, and mustache, I'm pretty sure, of the man in the Met portrait. he sits in front of a dark background, one hand on his hip, and the other hand, while it's holding a magnifying glass, is also gesturing towards his wife, which is a common thing for men to do in pair portraits. But the cape over his arm and and at the left there may recall for you another image. Here at the right, a picture that Peter Haring himself sold at auction in Amsterdam in 1639, which is probably the highlight of his career, Rembrandt's portrait of the great Renaissance courtier, Benedetto Castiglione. Above it, you see a drawing of the picture that Rembrandt made and noted the huge price. Then in the middle there, we see Rembrandt adopting the pose for himself in an etching of the same year, and he gave himself the ease and confidence of a courtier. The pose he gave the cultivated connoisseur Haring is similar in the turn of the shoulder, the tilt of the head, the big cape, except for the hands, which Castiglione and Rembrandt had clasped in front of themselves. Around 1980, we found out that Haring had also clasped his hands, but that Rembrandt then covered them up. How we found that out might interest you. The X-ray couldn't tell us, because it registers the densest things. It shows the stretcher bars behind the canvas, the tacks that secure the canvas to the stretcher, a lot of lead white in the face. One hand shows up, the one we see on the surface, because it too was painted with lead white. But if we use another kind of radiation, we can see other things. What you're seeing is an autoradiograph produced by a relatively new imaging technique called neutron activation autoradiography. Let me take just a minute to explain. This process gives us a kind of map of the distribution of chemical elements in the painting, some of which, like lead and cobalt and mercury, are present in the artist's pigments. And it lets us identify which, no matter when he used them, in the painting process. Since Rembrandt didn't make many preparatory drawings for portraits, we've supposed that when he had the sitter in front of him, he worked directly on the canvas, but we didn't know how he began. The autoradiograph shows us. There in the sleeves and the neck, you can see the broad brush drawing that Rembrandt first laid down on the paint. He used the pigment bone black for that. Now, bone black contains the element phosphorus, which exposes the film, turning it dark. Why did it do that? Because the picture made a trip to the reactor at Brookhaven National Laboratory and received a mild flux of neutrons, similar to what cancer patients get. The neutrons convert a tiny proportion of the chemical elements in the artist's materials into radioactive isotopes. The different isotopes then decompose, some right away, others over hours and weeks and even months, each isotope at a precisely known rate of speed. In decomposing, they give off gamma rays, which are what expose the film. During a 50-day period, 9 films get exposed. And the images on the film vary depending on which elements at the time are emitting the most gamma rays. The phosphorus isotope in bone black took from 8 to 30 days to decay, and by then most of the other isotopes were spent, except for the mercury in the vermilion in the thick red of his sleeve, which shows up as that dark patch at the left. And the point here is that not just that we see a big, broad underdrawing, but also that we learn that Rembrandt's first idea for Peter Haring's hands was to have them clasped in front of them, just as Castiglione's were. Then the artist, or Peter Haring himself, thought better of that, and Haring lost a hand, but he gained his identifying attribute, a magnifying glass. The portrait of the woman, whom we assume was Herring's wife, Elizabeth, has a painting on the wall behind her. We can't make out the subject, but we can see the gold frame and a curtain of a kind that covered many pictures to protect them from the dust. This pulled halfway aside, adding to the air of revealing and concealing that the portraits themselves have. The autoradiograph didn't tell us much new, but the X-ray had revealed something startling. At the lower left corner, there was a child's head looking up. It was just blocked in roughly and never carried out very far before it was painted out again. Either Rembrandt and his clients thought better of including the child, or they had a child who died while the picture was being painted. We won't know until we learn more about the lives of Peter Herring and his wife, Elizabeth. These are two of the most sympathetic faces in all of Rembrandt's portraits. They each look out at the viewer with a combination of candor and remoteness that's tantalizing, but in the end, I think, impenetrable. She holds the carnation so we can see it, inviting us to witness the bond between them. He holds a tool of his trade that alludes to his expertise, his discerning eye. She offers the flower of her dedication in an aura of soft light that gives it a tint of mystical significance. Rembrandt presents marital fidelity clothed in antiquity, as he does in The Jewish Bride. Fidelity, we might say, is sanctified by ancient tradition. Rembrandt's historical awareness has been a theme in these talks. His consciousness of being an heir to a long artistic tradition was certainly behind his uniquely large output of self-portraits. These were advertisements for himself and demonstrations of his skill. In costume and pose, they were a bid by Rembrandt for a place in the lineage of the greatest artists, not just Dürer and Titian, but beginning with the king of painters, Zeuxis. Invoking kingliness was evidently a reason for his enthroning himself in the portrait in the Frick at the right of a few years before The Jewish Bride, and for his magnificent costume. It was in this portrait and a few others that Rembrandt developed some of the painting techniques we have been seeing. For the halter around his neck, a buildup of broken, thick, even clotted textures, and for the flesh and parts of the costume, a combination of fluent strokes with a brush charged with paint. That fluency is something that he'd practiced on people he knew, particularly his friend Jan Six, as we saw in the previous talk. Six, here who he portrayed with an amazing feat of suggestive brushwork, and who was a patron adventuresome enough to understand what Rembrandt was up to, and was probably flattered that Rembrandt knew he would understand. Artists and connoisseurs recognized this way of painting as what was called the rough style, whose great practitioner had been Titian. According to a manual for artists by Karel van Mander that every Dutch painter knew, the rough style is not something that beginners should try. Rembrandt's style first loosened and roughened in this so-called Kitchen Maid of 1651, which can be considered the beginning of his late period. It's not a portrait, but it's a favorite Dutch genre subject, meaning a scene drawn from everyday life, a girl looking out a window. The model hasn't been identified, but she wears pearls, so she's certainly not a kitchen maid or any other kind of servant. Look how the broad strokes for the red fabric work, and look how thick the paint is for her loose blouse. It's all perfectly persuasive, For Rembrandt, this was a way to experiment, to push at the boundaries of how people might expect a finished painting to look. At this moment, I'm just going to pause and remind you that there's a question and answer period right after I end this talk. So if you've got questions, please use the chat feature on your screen. At the same time Rembrandt was painting in this way, he was doing something similar as a printmaker. Experiments like this one that expand the possibilities of suggestion are part of Rembrandt's approach to printmaking, as you saw a couple of talks ago. In this landscape, he uses the finest, thinnest possible lines for the flat ground lines and the far distance. But to produce that shadowy foliage, he gouges copper out of the plate. And when it's printed, it gives a haze to some lines and produces actual blots where he needs the blackest darks. This technique is dry point, a kind of rough style for prints. The terrific variety of the ink lines produces here effects of fictive textures and light that are really something entirely new in graphic art. He practiced this rough manner on pictures of his family, not just in painting, but in drawing too, sometimes using a brush to create a figure with just a couple of dozen strokes. Those dark strokes are as confident as any calligrapher's, and he drags the dry brush or half-dry brush along the pebbly surface of the paper to get luminous half shadows. The most endearing of these paintings for me are the pictures of his young son, Titus. Here, Titus is 14. He's working at a desk, pen in hand, dangling his pen case, pondering. Giving almost half the picture space to the front of the desk as a device that isolates the boy, elevates him. It hints at the size of his task that he's supposed to be performing. What makes this picture memorable for me is the kind of unfocused expression and its suggestion of distant thoughts that are unreachable by us. And the quality of the paint, which is fluid here and there, but also dry and crumbly in other places, with not a stroke wasted anywhere. This is a different boy, younger, with a more direct kind of intimacy. It's in the Simon Museum. Since Rembrandt left it unfinished, for what reasons we don't know, it gives you a kind of painting lesson. And I want to read just a bit of what Ernst van der Wetering wrote about the technique, because he describes the process so well, certainly better than I could. He wrote this: "The gray-brown ground with which this canvas was evenly prepared has remained almost entirely uncovered on the boy's chest and right shoulder. The colored ground has an immediate advantage. With just a few light and dark licks of paint on this intermediate tone, you already have a painting with convincing rendering, as can be seen in the boy's arms and chest. Adding a dark background around the boy's silhouette ensures that the figure stands freely in the pictorial space." The painting is then already so far developed that it tickles and amuses the eye of the painter, as one contemporary of Rembrandt wrote. And Van der Wetering continues, thus amusing and stirring the desire to continue. The cursory addition of the white collar and the beret and some light touches on the small face would have been as though a light had been switched on in the painting. And then Rembrandt could patiently work out in detail the face and the glossy hair. After that, for whatever reason, work was abruptly abandoned. At the right side, notice those busy scribbling brushstrokes. We can't tell for sure what they would have depicted, but the chances are that Rembrandt intended to paint the boy with a falcon. This was a fashionable way for parents of good families or aristocratic aspirations to have their sons portrayed. There's not much room on Rembrandt's canvas left for a falcon, though, which may be a reason that he gave up that idea. Rembrandt did not lose his interest in biblical subjects or ancient history. In the 1650s and 60s, he returned to subjects that he treated long before, and he saw them differently. In the same year as he painted Titus at his desk, he went back to the story in Genesis of Joseph, the virtuous young Israelite, who was sold into slavery in Egypt, worked in the house of the Pharaoh's captain called Potiphar. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, grabbing his robe and trying to pull him into bed, but Joseph escaped, minus the robe. When the husband came home later, she lied to him and said Joseph had tried to rape her. That's what Rembrandt shows: the wife's false story, the husband listening, and Joseph's reaction of distress. This is another picture with a complicated physical history. About 13 years ago, we learned from an X-ray that you're seeing here that the Rembrandt had painted this composition on top of another picture that was only partly finished of an old man. You can see where the arrow is, perhaps a priest or a prophet. The old man evidently had something to do with this drawing of a similar figure. Later on, somebody else repainted a few parts, why we don't know, mainly the figure of Joseph, who's not as strongly painted as the other two. Now, tack on one more footnote. Rembrandt not only collected all sorts of Middle Eastern costumes, but he made a study of court dress in India in the process of copying illuminated manuscripts that he got hold of. Here in his drawing in the Getty Museum, you see the great potentate on the left, Shah Jahan, the 17th century Mughal emperor, and his son. Those were useful for Rembrandt when, as he did here, he needed to approximate English Egyptian costume of the Old Testament era. 20 years before, he had chosen an earlier moment in the story where the woman is all desire and Joseph is all aversion, having a tug of war that's fairly comical and definitely salacious. To show the aftermath, as Rembrandt did here, was unusual, but a lot more interesting because it's about words. It's about brazen lies, in fact, which require convincing body language and facial expressions, all played more subtly. The image on the screen is not great, but it does convey something of the light falling on the bed, the false crime scene, and bounces up softly to illuminate the attentive Potiphar. And his wife is a terrific villainess. I mean, in a splendid robes, legs crossed, bodice a bit open, earnestly working on her husband, playing the abused innocent with no shame at all. This etching illustrates an episode from the gripping adventures of Esther, one of the Israelite captives in Babylon, who had the good fortune to be chosen queen by the king Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Esther's father, Mordecai, is the old man on the horse, had fallen afoul of the king's chief minister, Haman, who plotted to have Mordecai and all the Jews killed. The king didn't know about this, but he learned about the good deeds Mordecai had done, and he asked his minister, Haman, how an especially virtuous man ought to be rewarded. Haman assumed that the king meant him, and he answered, with a triumph and a parade. Good, said the king. Go and do that for Mordecai the Jew and lead the parade yourself. Now that turnabout is what Rembrandt chose to show in the etching, where you can see the evil Haman leading the bemused Mordecai in a parade that he thought was going to be his, while people bow down, and way up at the right, the king and Queen Esther looking on. Haman's face is a study of conflict and anxiety, as he's forced to humble himself in public to celebrate the goodness of his enemy. But there's worse to come for him. Esther invites the king and Haman to a banquet. This is how a pupil of Rembrandt imagined the scene of the banquet. Esther says she has a request for the king. He promises her, oh yes, you could have half my kingdom. She said there's a plot to exterminate all her people. He asks, who would do such a thing? She tells him it's Haman. The king arose in his wrath and left the room. Then Haman pleads with the queen for his life. In this version, the queen points Haman out, and the guilty man wrings his hands, and the king looks like he's going to whack him with a scepter. A much better painter, Jan Steen, made this subject a favorite of his. For him, it was an opera buffa with big chorus, lots of color, a trio downstage overacting their parts, the Zaftig queen, virtuous in blue, the hot-headed king in the middle losing it and arising in his wrath, and the overdressed, cowering villain Haman crumpled in his chair. In Rembrandt's version, there's hardly any physical action at all, not even eye contact. There's very little decor and not much light either, just enough to pull the figures out of the dark and to make the costumes, the headgear worn by Esther and the king, glow and sparkle. I should say, of course, that the colors are falsified here by the yellow varnish that the Pushkin Museum still hasn't removed. Esther is speaking. She's telling the truth, making an accusation. An awareness is dawning on the king, who listens and raises his scepter just a little and grips it. The gestures are small. The facial expressions are subtle. But look how the shapes of the king and the queen make a pyramid that excludes the guilty Haman, who's out there on his own, making no move, no protest, simply looking down. So geometry helps to tell the story, and so does the light. Since Rembrandt's audience knew that story, he expected that his viewers could recall or could imagine the words that Esther is speaking and what all three are thinking. Rembrandt was attracted to scenes of truth being revealed and justice being done. In an earlier talk, we discussed how he treated the parable of the prodigal son, first casting a man who looks a lot like Rembrandt as the son, carousing and wasting his inheritance. And he etched the son's return home to his father's house in rags, filthy, barefoot, where he's welcomed. In the end, it was the theme of reconciliation that held him. He drew the subject later, but he didn't paint it as far as we know. When he finally did paint it, a few years before his death, it's a large picture. The figures are life-size. The father envelops his ragged son. The bystanders simply look on. The action is pared down. The whole image has a solemn hush. And the details count. The dirty sole of one bare foot has scars. The son is even more abject than before. His silk trim says that these rags are the clothes that he left home with, but now they're filthy, and his head is scabrous and almost bald. The parable in Luke describes a lot of action. The father runs to the son confesses that he sins, he's unworthy. The father orders his best robe and sandals and ring for him and calls for a feast to celebrate. The virtuous stay-at-home son is angry at this and complains of unfairness. The father says not to complain, but to rejoice that he who was lost has been found. In this painting, all that's happened already, and his audience knew that it had. Rembrandt skips the commotion, skips the complaining, skips the physical action. What he shows is that repentance has brought forgiveness and pure reconciliation. In these last paintings, you've been seeing very little physical movement and instead a pattern of isolation and introspection. Compositions have a simple geometries and are shallow rather than spatially deep and complex. And many of them represent single figures, characters removed from their traditional dramatic roles in biblical and classical narratives, on stage alone. Here's where we ended the second talk with the climax of a famous episode from the early Roman history as told by Livy. This is Lucretia. Lucretia was a virtuous Roman wife who was tricked into submitting to rape by a son of the tyrant Tarquin the Proud. Rather than disgrace her family, Lucretia killed herself. Her relatives vowed to avenge her. They drove out the Tarquins, and the Roman Republic was born. Lucretia's example of heroic self-sacrifice was taught to pupils in the Latin schools that Rembrandt and his clients went to. The subject was painted frequently, and there were plenty of models for it, but Rembrandt makes up action of his own. He gives her a fabulous gold robe, like the one that Rebecca wears in The Jewish Bride, and under it a white chemise that suggests innocence, and a terrible red stain where she's been pierced. Rembrandt makes her deathly pale, sad, and has her pull the cord that will draw the curtains of the bed and bring action to the close. Rembrandt painted a dozen odd saints and apostles in these last years, single figures, isolated, lost in thought. Among them are several self-portraits in the guise of St. Paul. I think he was advertising a bond he felt with the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul's letters did in prose something like what Rembrandt tried to do in pictures, help people understand scriptures and respond to them with their emotions as well. Emotions as well as intellect. And to see in scriptures their duties to God and to each other. He wears the turban-like cap that he wore in the studio, and his jacket is plain and worn. The apostles are imaginary portraits, most of which we can identify by the traditional attributes that Rembrandt gave them. He tried his hand at this 30 years earlier. Here's a man with an emotionally charged expression holding a knife. Pictures of this subject were cataloged in 18th and 19th century under various literal-minded titles like Portrait of a Butcher or Rembrandt's Barber or An Assassin. I imagine they sold better that way compared to their actual identity, which was Saint Bartholomew the Apostle, who was skinned alive and beheaded in Macedon, where he'd gone to preach the gospel. His horrific martyrdom was a popular subject in Rembrandt's time, particularly in Spain and Italy, where he's usually strung up and we see the operation proceeding. In Rembrandt's small panel, the torment is mental. Bartholomew looks anxious, fearful, even anguished, possibly signaling some foreknowledge of coming events. quarter of a century later, Rembrandt turned to St. Bartholomew again, putting him in a chair, leaning forward, seemingly in conversation with somebody out of the frame. His mouth is open, his forehead and eyebrows express vividly the intensity of his absorption. The climax of these invented portraits is this man who sits foursquare in front of us, gripping the knife and regarding us with raised eyebrows. Rembrandt must surely have wanted us to imagine St. Bartholomew having a premonition, weighing the consequences of what's to come, first terrible, then glorious. The movements of his mind again seem to be what moves his forehead to send waves. Rembrandt seldom painted flesh in such high relief. It's another case where the paint itself actually casts shadows, as though the paint had become flesh. The hand is painted differently, first underpainted in gray, then modeled with quick strokes and stabs of blue and red. Even closer in, the illusion begins to break down, and you can see each swoop of the brush, each stab and flick. The texture gives an unnerving sense of vitality and presence to the man, as though he were living and breathing, and inviting us to share his contemplation of terrible things to come, and perhaps the rewards that he's been promised. These have been imaginary portraits. And there were also actual portraits during the 1660s that show how Rembrandt was capable of exploring depths of feeling in these people right up till the end of his life. Long hair was in style then, and gray hair was back shortly before the powdered wig came into fashion, which was an import from France, by the way. Then anybody could have it. We don't know who this man was, but he's dressed in the elegant black worn by Amsterdam patricians, and he sits in front of a red curtain, another conventional attribute of status. What's appealing here is that the face is alive and the expression is momentary. He's shown just beginning to speak, as though to the painter or to us. And the vividness comes partly from the brushwork again, especially the hair, the springy kind of slinky-like curls twirled on with the brush, and the welter of small touches on the face. This portrait, which the Marz House bought a few years ago, is so informal that it's assumed that it was represented somebody Rembrandt knew and could paint with a collar open and the hat askew. The hat may look louche to us now, but it didn't then. Big cocked hats had come into fashion in the 1660s and were worn by leading citizens, even in official commissioned portraits. I mean, here's a roughly contemporary portrait by Frans Hals that's even more relaxed and forgiving compared to the painting by Rembrandt of a chubby face of this man. Rembrandt's man is eroded by age and reddened by self-indulgence and food and smoke and drink. There's one group portrait of these last years. This family, painted life-size. It's not only full of good humor, but it has another display of the warmth and glitter of Rembrandt's surfaces. If it were better preserved, it would be a rival for the Jewish Bride, but it's still pretty wondrous as it is, and it's even more varied in its effects. Like the Jewish Bride, its background has darkened so much that you have to look hard to see that there are leaves there. The setting is a garden, which was once green and much lighter. There are quite a few family portraits of this type, many of them set out of doors, most of them affecting a kind of courtly elegance in the poses and the fashion consciousness of the costumes, like this one by Rembrandt's former pupil, Jurgen Ovens, and this one by a very skillful competitor of Rembrandts in Amsterdam, Bartolomeos Van Der Helst. Van der Helst had painted a lot of witty, affectionate portrait groups like this, much lighter in tone than Rembrandt's, with brighter colors and glossy fabrics. This was the trend, but Rembrandt conspicuously did not adopt that approach and went his own way, and still found clients for his distinctive way of painting. Distinct him, I think, in the touching openness he gives to the faces. Here we have a father who doesn't put on paternal airs, but clearly feels warm satisfaction with his family. And he offers a carnation, which gets the attention of the beguiling little girl and her less demonstrative older sister. Babies are often shown reaching for their mother's breast. That's how it was for centuries in Madonna and child compositions. But here, the child looks at us with a kind of mischievous face and grips a teething ring with one hand, with the other seems to push her mother away. And the mother indulges the child. Her face is the smoothest piece of painting in the picture. The child's costume gets the palette knife treatment, while her cap and her hair and her collar are scumbled with dryish paint that puts across the vibrancy of the light that rakes across them. The dutiful sister carries a basket of flowers. Rembrandt's paint makes the blossoms look like jewels. In these talks, I've wanted you to consider Rembrandt's works as creations of intellect and insight and empathy. I've urged you to observe how he sees and conveys the heart of the matter, whether it's a story or an individual person or a complex relationship like this one. For this relationship between two contemporaries of his, he finds a biblical guise. He identifies their devotion with ancient virtue that he saw as all the greater for being aligned with God's laws. Rembrandt achieved his purposes not only with his intellect and insight, but also with his hand, the sureness and delicacy of his line, and the force and the richness of color on the brush. Well, I've been urging you to look at Rembrandt's pictures slowly and closely. I hope you'll do that here in Los Angeles museums and wherever you can find Rembrandt, and that you'll give the pictures a chance to do their work. Slow down. As I suggested at the beginning, make the guards nervous. On that subject, I'm going to call as a witness another Dutch painter, Vincent van Gogh. When he first saw The Jewish Bride in 1885, he said that he'd gladly give up 10 years of his life for the chance to sit in front of it for 2 weeks with just a crust of dry bread for food. The man knew how to look. Now, as I end the series, I just want to say to you how grateful I am to you out there on Zoom for the alert attention you've paid to what I've had to say and to what I've been privileged to show you of Rembrandt's work. Thank you all.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you so much, John, for this amazing talk and wonderful, wonderful series. It's really, I can't reiterate how generous it is of you to bring all of us into the world of art history and the art historical argument and make it so exciting. I mean, it's something that I think people might on the surface think is very dry, and with you, it's more like a thriller novel. We even today got a secret nuclear laboratory as part of the story, which makes it really very exciting. So,
Well, it's exciting for me. I mean, you never know what it's like for normal people if you're enthusiastic the way I am. So I'm really glad. Thanks.
well, you transmit it very beautifully. Um, and speaking of nuclear laboratory, uh, the Metropolitan Museum might be able to afford to bombard all these paintings with protons and neutrons, etc. But is that safe for the paintings? And is there other ways to get this information? Or
Yeah, it sounds scary, but they wouldn't have done it if it hadn't been pretty well tested out in advance. I mean, it is not for nothing that they went to a nuclear reactor site that had a patient port, so-called, for cancer patients. The flux of neutrons that cause the elements, the atoms in the paint to become isotopes, radioactive isotopes, that flux is only 1 out of 1,000 of the atoms exposed actually becomes irradiated and gives off gamma rays. So there's really no danger either to the technicians who do the work or to the paint layers. And that's been shown by over now some 20 odd or more years of work. But it's laborious and it's not cheap. I mean, you've got to take an important painting off the wall and do without it for a couple of months while it lives out in the middle of Long Island or wherever your reactor is. So the expense is largely been rationalized by the usefulness to, production of knowledge, which has been a lot, though it isn't always productive in unique ways. And that's why I showed you the example, an example where we get to see the big underdrawing. You don't see that any other way. There's no technique to do that. There are techniques to detect the phosphorus in that bone black layer of drawing, but not to make a picture of it. The wonderful thing about these auto radiographs, which just simply means that the painting takes an X-ray of itself, in effect. By emitting those gamma rays, it gives you the entire presence of that element in the paint surface, which gives you, a drawing of in effect, a picture of the drawing.
what is the underdrawing made with? I mean, it's not graphite pencil, I assume.
No, it's bone black, which is a basic and very old. I mean, it goes probably back to caves in prehistoric times. Black made out of burnt bone. So that's what artists used for a long, long time. And so it's the key element in the first work that an artist does to lay out the composition. And we can't get to that. We can get to preparatory drawings that he made on paper, but those are very rare in portraiture. So when you see them in this way, produced by gamma rays, it's an event, especially if you discover something you didn't expect. For example, the extreme breadth of that drawing. Well, X-rays are good for other things, as I mentioned. I mean, X-rays show you mainly lead white, and in the case of that portrait where the child appears next to the mother and then disappears again under the artist's paint. That's something that X-ray can quite reliably find for you.
Yeah, I found that slightly terrifying, I have to admit. But so we're going to take audience questions, and I just want to remind the audience that if you don't see a chat box on your screen, you need to exit the full screen mode, and then you should see a speech bubble in your upper right corner, and that's where you would type in your questions. We have a question from Elise. She's asking if the absence of artificial light had an impact on how Rembrandt's paintings aged, and if his paintings have substantially darkened over time. Were they so dark because of conscious choice or by the materials available or because of the absence? Oh, I see. She's actually asking if the absence of artificial light, I think how he painted them to be dark because there wasn't a lot of evening
Oh, yeah.
light.
Um, well, the effect of light in modern light quite a lot brighter than the light that pictures you usually saw in Dutch interiors. That amount of light has definitely made a difference to the change in certain pigments. It may have accelerated the darkening of varnishes as well, but it has definitely cost us some colors, particularly ones made of dye stuffs, vegetable dye in particular, which is much more susceptible to fading in ultraviolet light. And there are many other changes too that come as a result of an unintended overexposure to light, you could say. Lighting in Dutch houses, as she suggests, was a whole lot less adequate, especially after the sun went down, than the light we have today. It revealed, in other words, much less, and it was much more unfocused, wasn't it? It was coming from candles and other lights in the middle of the room. Yes. So light has damaged works of art. It's also made them visible to us, sometimes to a degree that is not favorable to the meaning that things are overlighted quite easily and have been for years or even centuries at a time.
Yeah. Jan has a question, which I have to confess I had a similar thought. She says that the picture of St. Bartholomew, which was dated 1661, that's now at the J. Paul Getty Museum, the expression and the hair and the costume, and I will add the mustache, makes it seem as though it was painted in the 1930s. Do you concur?
Yes. Yeah, it is amazing. There's no explanation that I know of it. That's, in my experience, virtually unique style of hair, and everything else that looks can be found in other paintings. But that short hair is amazing, and it does make it look like an uncle of yours who's onto you and wondering and wondering about you.
Yeah, it's such an incredible painting.
Yeah.
We have a couple of people asking you to compare Rembrandt with other painters. John says that given the breadth of Rembrandt's achievement, why would a Vermeer exhibition probably outdraw a Rembrandt exhibition today? Or would it? I mean, they don't ask that.
Yeah, I wonder whether it really would, but it might. I think people have seen more Rembrandts. I think the Vermeer's output is so much smaller. At most 3 dozen pictures, and all jealously guarded and only lent to very important exhibitions, usually in places far away from here or New York even. So I think the events are rarer, and the mystique of certain paintings is maybe even more powerful than with Rembrandt. I'm thinking, of course, of the girl with the earring, and maybe also the view of Delft, which, by the way, I don't think gets lent anymore at all. These are pictures that we all have in our mind's eye, and some of them even have novels written about them. So maybe Vermeer would outdraw a Rembrandt exhibition. I don't know. I think they're all filled to capacity when they're held.
Yeah, maybe having films with Scarlett Johansson doesn't hurt the
That helps.
value either. And Geetha also wants you to compare Rembrandt, but this time to Picasso.
Funny she should ask. Um, well, yeah, Rembrandt's scope, I would say, in terms of, I was going to say subject matter, was narrower. Now, I would just say this, that Picasso was staggeringly productive and almost obsessively devoted day after day, or you could say hour after hour, to producing images. And he lived a long time. He lived almost twice. His career was almost twice as long as Rembrandt's. He lived a 70-year career, 70 years of productivity, and really turned things out. The pattern of his, and he did sculpture, and he had sidelines in various decorative arts, like ceramics, for instance. When he made prints, he had them made, and they were run off on lithographic presses in huge numbers. So the sheer presence of Picasso, owing to the output, the sheer amount of imagery, and of course the availability for such a long time of large numbers of photomechanical illustrations, illustrated books, and the like. I think he's been far more exposed, although the works of art are, in most cases, much less accessible, much more difficult to work your way through Picasso's various meanings and implications. It's not really a language we've ever mastered, I would say, about Cubism, because it's of its nature so difficult to figure out, to, in a sense, paraphrase. Whereas Rembrandt, I think, can be dealt with in a more kind of analytical and descriptive way. And Rembrandt's relationship to earlier art is, I think, vastly richer and more detailed, in the sense he draws on other imagery that came before and works variations on it or takes off from it. And Picasso does the same, but I think not as regularly. And of course, in the great stretches of related works of the 1930s and 40s, for example, the so-called Weeping Women, he's really on his own. He's not drawing extensively, if at all, on earlier precedents.
Well, that lines us up nicely for Margot's question. Oh, yeah. She says, John, you showed us one genre scene, the kitchen maid, but everything else is history, mythology, and portraits. Did Rembrandt consider traditional genre scenes like Metsu, Du, Steen, etc., beneath him?
Well, beneath him is too harsh. He painted other low-end subjects. And when I say low-end, I'm not being a snob in this 21st century. I'm saying that the standard of importance in the 17th century was the same as it had been in the 16th and the 15th. It had been a long tradition that pictures with serious subjects, that is, history paintings, paintings of the Bible, stories of real actual history, Roman and antique history and so forth, allegorical subjects. Those were just, because they required more intellectual work, more imagination, and usually more figures in more complex situations, that those subjects were inherently more important, and they could do more for you. The contemplation of those subjects could have a kind of edifying moral effect on people. That theory, those theories are baked into art when Rembrandt comes along. He comes along into a culture, though, that has much more interest in the world around them, in the landscape, in life indoors led by ordinary people, and many other such subjects. Rembrandt touches all of them. Picks up everything. There's nothing he doesn't do, including still life. But he does relatively little of it. And for all we know, he might have done some of these genre subjects at the request of somebody who admired his work, loved his style, but didn't want a Bible scene.
This one, I think, might appeal to you. Paula asks if you're familiar with the video artist Bill Viola, which I know you are familiar with Bill Viola because he's shown at the Getty Museum. Some of Viola's work, although very different, evokes the feel of the Jewish bride for her, contemplative with a transcendental stillness and constrained but powerful. Do you care to comment on that comparison?
I'd like Bill to hear that. I did that exhibition at the Getty.
Oh, I didn't know you were the.
Yeah, and Bill is a very dear friend of mine, and we did a book about him. And this interesting phase he has went through from the very end of the 90s for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, working on a relatively small scale of making videos that would be either projected, but then later actually played on small flat screens of subjects that were secular, or in other words, actors, but wearing costumes and doing things that recall situations in history paintings, paintings of Rembrandt's era and earlier. And there are a lot of them. The show we did at the Getty, for anybody who wants to see this for themselves, was called Bill Viola, The Passions. And it consisted largely of these small flat screen displays with extreme slow moving changes, so that it was like initially not knowing for sure whether something was still or moving. And the motion is so slow that you get to see the actors' faces and gestures act. You get to see them in a different way. You get to see them both as action and as stills. And you get to see how his point was, you get to see how their emotions are subtler. They're like music. They play out in different speeds and to different effect from stage to stage. So Lisa's absolutely right about the connection with Bill Viola, but that's because Bill Viola is highly conscious of older art and has, in this most recent and late work, exploited it and created a whole kind of another genre of video in extreme slow motion with fantastically sharp detail, as though it were a Renaissance or Baroque painting, more often Renaissance than Baroque, and with a high degree of emotional and, you could say, spiritual content, depending very much on what you bring to these images.
Yeah, I can definitely see the parallels. And I also feel like it's a testament to Rembrandt's genius that his paintings almost feel like they're live, like you're seeing, like a Bill Viola video where it's moving, but it's so subtle and small, but you're there in the live situation.
It's true. It's true. But when the Getty reopens, I just invite people to come and look at the St. Bartholomew, and because it's the best example we have in the area, and look and see how the paint imitates the actual three-dimensional structure of the face, as well as all the small stuff that happens to our very different and differently weathered faces. That's something that you can't get on a screen, and including even Bill Viola's amazingly high def imagery. That you have to see in your flesh, in the flesh, your flesh and its flesh in front of it. And of course, can't be in a hurry. You've got to slow down and look thoughtfully. It's very affecting when you do that with the best of Rembrandt's portraits.
Yeah, I have a friend who was able to go to the Louvre at some point during the COVID pandemic when there was nobody there, and to be able to actually look at the Mona Lisa without 8 million people taking selfies at the same time was pretty miraculous. I can't wait till museums open. Also, hopefully the Hammer will be able to open its doors soon.
Yes.
We miss all of our wonderful audience. And MM says she can't wait for museums, or he, can't tell, MM. They can't wait for museums to be open to the public again. And they ask, after Van Gogh, your wonderful series on Van Gogh here at the Hammer, and your Rembrandt series, what would you recommend as the next subject of the Dutch Golden Age?
Well, it's It's been a long time since there's been a show in the United States devoted to Franz Hals, who's a brilliant portrait painter. That might be something that could be concocted by an American museum. Those are the big artists, after all. It's down a few steps after that, but one-person shows are not the only possibility, and there are many others. It would also be fascinating for a different reason to, for an American audience and European audience for that matter, to look at what happens in Dutch art after Vermeer, what those artists look like who came along and took over the artistic practices that Rembrandt had mastered and Vermeer and his generation had. The work in Holland of the 1670s, 80s, 90s, and well into the 18th century. It was a kind of a cliche to say, well, it all went downhill. The French took over and their styles dominated. Well, that is true to a degree, but it's not the whole story. And there are marvelous artists whose names have not fully come out of the shadows, particularly outside Holland. And there's a show to be done, in other words, an ambitious exhibition about Dutch art after Vermeer. It won't pull like a Vermeer show will. So maybe the museum will have to call it Vermeer and later, or after Vermeer, but including Vermeer or something like that to make sure there's an audience.
We have a few questions here that I can address. Several people have asked about where they can see the first 5 lectures in this 6-lecture series. Today is the final lecture. They're all available right now on the Hammer website, and today's lecture will be available there probably today as well. Also, the Van Gogh series that John Walsh did for the Hammer Museum is available on the Hammer website, and he has many, 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 many wonderful art history lectures on the Yale University YouTube channels. They have a few different YouTube channels. John has taught many classes at Yale, and several of them have been recorded, so you can take his online courses as they are and see them there. And someone has asked, what classes do you currently teach at Yale, or are you currently teaching classes at Yale? That's from Rebecca.
No, I'm not. I have a group of graduate students that I am in a kind of teaching relationship with, and we do that on Zoom. I'm busy. Is it funny that somebody brought up Picasso? I'm busy working now on a series of lectures for Yale on Picasso. And for a general audience, not for students only, because it's an artist that everybody's heard of, and a few people have some images in their head for, but otherwise, an awful lot is not known by art-loving people. And so, or people who are willing to experiment with loving art. So that's coming up next. And that'll be available to everybody online. Same source that Caldy was just mentioning, the website of the Yale University Art Gallery has everything there. And you get a link to YouTube, which has a channel for the Yale University Art Gallery. Yeah, there are a lot of lectures there.
So now we have a few technical questions. Linda asks, can you comment on the hands of the father in The Return of the Prodigal Son? They seem so different from each other. Do you want to show the slide for that?
Hands of the father. Well, she may have seen something I haven't ever seen. Please bring up number 88.
We can all look at it together, which is the fun of this whole lecture series. I love this sort of mindful viewing of these paintings that you've been doing with the audience, where you just give us time to really look at it ourselves and get engaged with the work. I think that's really generous. And when the museum does reopen, we do have mindful art viewing sessions periodically where you go into the galleries with a mindful awareness instructor and look at an artwork mindfully. I'm just going to repeat for our technician Josephine that we're trying to see slide number 88. if possible. Maybe while that's coming up, I'll ask you a different question.
Sure.
Russell asks, have they recovered any of the larger cutoff sections of the bigger works?
Oh, we wish. No, oh, there we go. Now, if we could find those, we'd have a whole, you'd know about it. There'd be publicity. This is very interesting. Yeah, because the father's proper left hand definitely looks beefier, bigger than his right hand. I can't explain it.
Okay. We have several questions about other resources that people can go to. John has graciously provided us with an entire bibliography of books that he recommends about Rembrandt's work, and that's available on the Hammer website. So check that out. And one of our questioners asks, are there any films or novels that you recommend that describe life in the period that Rembrandt was working in, or ideally biographical to get a sense of the period? And I will start by saying, you did mention before this 1936 Charles Laughton film on Rembrandt. Are there any other films or novels that would bring us into Rembrandt's world?
Well, they're in the same era. The film with Charles Laughton is of the era that another book by a Dutch biographer appeared, which was, I think, called Rembrandt RVR Rembrandt. And the artist, the writer rather, is Hendrik Willem van Loon, who happens to be the author of a biography of Vincent van Gogh, which was the basis of a famous movie. In any case, the book by Hendrik Willem van Loon is a heavily novelized, but still very readable biography of Rembrandt. Don't believe, please, a lot of what he has to say about Rembrandt's life. You can learn much more from more recent books. I was asked a question actually by a friend of mine who has heard me talk about Rembrandt, and this question of Rembrandt and the Jews, prompted by the Jewish bride, made him ask me, wait a minute, that's not what I heard. I heard that he hung out with the Jews. He lived in the street with them. He lived on the Jodenbreestraat, the Jewish Broadway in Amsterdam. So what is going on here? The newer position is, and you heard me say this very briefly in front of the painting, The Jewish Bride, is that, yes, of course he knew Jews and he knew their scholarship, and he followed to a degree their sort of theological positions, certainly knew the Old Testament closely and used it, and used a model for Jesus, who may well have been a member of that Jewish community. But the idea that he was somehow adopted by and became willingly and happily a kind of member of that community is just an exaggeration. And you don't need it in any case to understand Rembrandt, I think. There have been two exhibitions that touch on that, and I didn't mention them, but I'll mention them now to anybody who's interested in this subject. It was a show in several American museums about 10 years ago called Rembrandt and the Face of Jesus, Rembrandt and the Face of Jesus. And the catalog is not in print, but there are lots of copies and you can get them easily on the used book market. And also on the subject, even more pointedly, a Dutch publication now in English called, and this is I'm going to make air quotes here, The Jewish Rembrandt, The Myth Unraveled. And that came out about 5 years before the American show, produced by that exhibition was done by the Rembrandt House in Amsterdam. That can be found too in an English edition, The Jewish Rembrandt, The Myth Unraveled. there's a fascinating debate going on. It's kind of a generational thing too, about the Jewishness of Rembrandt.
Thank you for addressing that, because we did have several questions I was going to read aloud about that. One that is still related, Giselle asks if Rembrandt painted anybody in the Jewish community with traditional Jewish clothing like strummel hats and religious artifacts.
Not specifically that I know of. I think not. The clothing in his hampers or trunks of exotic clothing included all kinds of Middle Eastern gear that it's very difficult to specify as to the exact ethnicity. Anyway, you don't know exactly where it comes from. But there's more now written about Rembrandt's costume, and which might lead to some specific connection to Jewish ritual or Jewish costume practice. So more may well appear.
This is an interesting question from Yeping Wang. Do you think that after Rembrandt's bankruptcy, his works became better?
That's been part of the Rembrandt myth, that becoming poor made him somehow deeper, wiser.
Maybe more creative. Constraints sometimes do force an artist to innovate.
I think he might have to work harder and should take shortcuts and produce more to sell more. I don't see a connection, and nowadays it'd be unfashionable to suggest such a thing anyway, because now we think he just kept on trucking and produced without too proud to make concessions.
Aaliyah asks, Adolf Monticelli was a late 19th century French artist somewhat obsessed with Rembrandt. Do you know anything about him and this relationship?
Sure. He was a Provençal artist, very much influenced, for a time anyway, Vincent van Gogh. His work was shown in Paris. He was kind of I think a roughly contemporary and colleague of Cézanne, also a Southerner. Famous for his very thickly painted still lifes, which is what Vincent van Gogh went for. And of course, he loved Rembrandt. I mean, that's the great model for a painter who worked in a relatively dark end of the value scale and with extremely thick application of paint. So yeah, Monticelli was a real factor in the French avant-garde of the 1870s and 80s.
We have sort of two bookending questions. It sort of reminds me of those marriage paintings with the husband and wife on the left and the right. Peter asks if you have a favorite of all of Rembrandt's paintings, and if so, why? And Deborah asks, what are the painters that Rembrandt most admired?
Right. Well, let's go backwards. Who did he admire the most? You've heard me talk about Titian more than once, and certainly he has to be very high up. Although Rubens painted very differently and had a different practice, he was a contemporary until Rubens died in the 1640s. And he was certainly the most eminent, except for Rembrandt, the most eminent artist in the North. He had a terrific admiration for a German who nowadays is almost completely obscure, but was famous, called Adam Elsheimer, whose work consists almost entirely of small panel paintings, often on copper, engraved by a Dutch artist who made Elsheimer well known. And you've actually seen an example or two of his work called Hendrik Goud, Goudt. Anyway, Elsheimer was, at what he did, perfect. He was imaginative in terms of choice of subject, very skilled at disposing the figures and getting them to do believable things that carry out the theme and so forth. So he had and for me, I mean, Rembrandt knew a lot about old master paintings after all, because he was something of a dealer. He had works that came and went from his shop that he seems to have bought at auction. And he followed the trade, such as it was. Amsterdam had, in fact, quite a brisk trade in old masters. Auctions were a place where artists gathered. So he saw a lot. I'm sure if I thought harder about it, I could come up with a name or two more. Obviously, everybody respected and loved Raphael. He had that experience of seeing the Raphael Castiglione sold at auction and made a drawing after it. There is a literature on the influences on Rembrandt of older art, and that's easily reached. It's in all the bibliographies.
And what about your particular favorite?
I was hoping I might not have to say.
You don't have to answer that.
No, I never had a more intense experience, I suppose, with Rembrandt than when the painting of the abduction of Europa came to the Getty. It didn't just come. I mean, I had known the picture for, I don't know, 20 years or so. It belonged to a kind of reclusive and not very agreeable Swiss guy who did not want to have anything to do with me and my requests when I worked at the Met to borrow the picture so the public could see it. This picture that you saw in this exhibit, if you didn't see the first lecture in this series, go and look at it because there's some good images of it. Anyway, it shows a river scene that looks almost Dutch with an astounding wagon from which Princess of Tyre had come, as it's told in Ovid's Metamorphoses and other stories, gone and been abducted by the bull, who's actually Jupiter in disguise. And all of this is before what you see. What you see is the bull with the beautiful Europa on his back, swimming, you don't know this, but towards Crete from the the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. Anyway, it's a fairy tale, but treated quite seriously with an edge of humor. And in the style that Rembrandt had perfected before he even made a big career in Amsterdam, that is 1632 or thereabouts. It's the picture that shows, as well as anything else, the launch of Rembrandt, the fabulous storytelling history painter. Anyway, the picture was like Mr. Klotz wouldn't talk to me, and picture passed to his family, and finally my successor at the Metropolitan Museum got to borrow it, showed it. It was yellow. It was covered with dirty varnish, but still it was amazing and wonderful. And then a friend of ours, mine, suggested that it was for sale, completely a third party. And one thing led to another. Our curator managed to make a deal and we bought the picture. It was tremendous, and then got even better when the painting went sent to the conservation studio, and Mark Leonard, the then conservator, gently removed the yellow varnish, and we could see what Rembrandt had intended, this astonishing range of colors and this vivid, amazing, as I say, fairy tale landscapes. That's a picture I'm attached to for as much for circumstance as for its intrinsic quality. Both are wonderful, though.
I once had the great privilege of having a tour of the Getty Conservation Laboratories, and it's utterly thrilling.
Yeah.
It's just incredible what they do there. I don't know if there are public tours, but if so, I highly recommend to our audience to try and go there when things reopen. Well, I'm going to ask the final question. I feel like over the last 6 weeks, we've learned so much about Rembrandt. It feels exhaustive, not exhausting. It's thrilling, and I'm still on the edge of my seat, but very thorough. And I'm wondering what if this was a 10 lecture series or a whole semester? Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that you just couldn't fit in? Where else would you go?
Yeah, it's a nice idea. Well, I would, I'd like to, I'd like to talk about Rembrandt's teaching, Rembrandt's pupils, this whole diaspora of artists whom he taught the rudiments to. Some of them from early youth to, and some of them already trained, who absorbed some aspects of his style and went out in the world and had careers. I think that would be a fascinating subject, and I've never tried to tackle it exactly, to try to deal with the full reach of Rembrandt's teaching and how it is that his pupils, in some cases, made out better in the world than he did after 1650 or so. I don't know, in this series, I showed drawings by Rembrandt, but I don't think I did justice to Rembrandt's drawings as a particular achievement. I mean, he's as great a draftsman as ever lived, I think. He had more different kinds of skills. He was more sure-handed in his ability to put down on paper in the fewest possible moves the essential character of whatever it is he was looking at.
Yeah, I loved it when you made the comment about the girl being like as sure of a hand as a calligrapher.
Yeah,
That
wasn't
is a spectacular drawing.
like a Chinese brush drawing? So I'd love to do a longer series on, or a series, or at least one lecture on the drawings as drawings, as an art form. And I was also thinking, quite different from that, it would be interesting to study and talk to you all about how to say it, how we know what we know about Rembrandt. That is, what the sources of our knowledge were, how that changed over the generations, how Rembrandt had a kind of a great fame that didn't last all that long. The fame lasted long, but the favor didn't necessarily. That he was criticized heavily for being too dark and too crude. Things changed out from under Rembrandt, and he no longer met the style that was fashionable in his late years. And then for several hundred years, opinions have evolved about him, as much reflecting what art of the time looked like and what the standards and appeal of art were. Art criticism and theory, in other words, has changed along with culture, naturally, like every other kind of criticism. So it would be interesting just to study and reconstruct visually how we think we know, we meaning any given generation, know and think we know about an artist. Rembrandt in particular, I think, is a very rich subject. It goes on. I mean, what we thought when I was a student is not what many people think now about many aspects of Rembrandt's work. That's the reason why we gave the series that funny title, Here and Now. The now being, now with all of our limits, all of our blindnesses, we still see qualities in Rembrandt that are thrilling to us. Those thrills aren't all shared by everybody, and the younger you are, probably the more you've moved on to other qualities that are interesting about Rembrandt, diagnostically and otherwise. We're interested in the culture that Rembrandt lived in. We're interested in the sources of the money that his clients spent on his work and so on. So anyway, that kind of historiographical approach to Rembrandt's career and his fame would be a fascinating subject.
And that's what made this whole series so exciting, because it's not a static collection of facts. It's a constantly evolving interpretation and science and learning more and more and more about him. It's like a detective story, and it's really exciting. Well, I have to say, it's been my great delight and pleasure and my honor to spend these 6 Sunday afternoons with you, John. I really appreciate it.
Claudia, thank you so much.
And thanks to the crew that we don't see, but they're doing the work behind the scenes.
Yes, our extraordinary, talented staff. Thank you so much to all of them. And I hope we'll see you again very, very soon in person. And if not, on Zoom. Thank you, John. And thank you, everyone watching out in the audience.
Thanks, audience.
Bye.